Hello, dear listeners. You are very welcome to this exciting journey through time. Today we will learn about a story that transports us to Mexico in 1883, where a young woman named Soledad will discover that even in the most adverse circumstances, the human heart is capable of flourishing. This is a narrative about courage, dignity, and the transformative power of true love, the kind that doesn't save but walks alongside in the journey of healing. Imagine a dusty square where a young woman of only 20 years is offered as merchandise by her own father. Her hands tremble, but her eyes hold a strength that even she doesn't know yet. This is Soledad Morales, and her story will touch your heart in ways you never expected. In just a few minutes, you will discover how a humiliating sale transformed into the first step toward freedom. Tell me in the comments from which city are you joining us on this journey. I love knowing where our listeners come from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that, like so more people can learn about these stories that warm the soul. Villa del Silencio, northern Mexico, year 1883. The sun punished the dry earth of this small town, lost between mountains and silences, where each stone held untold stories and each wind carried echoes of hopes yet to be realized. Golden dust danced in the heavy afternoon air when Don Macedonio Morales dragged his daughter by the hand to the center of the main square of Villa del Silencio. Soledad walked with her head down, feeling the weight of curious gazes that stuck to her skin like dark honey. Her bare feet touched the irregular stones of the ground, and she could feel each rough texture through her hardened soles. The faded cotton dress, which had once been blue like a Sunday sky, now carried the indefinite color of resignation. 50 pesos, shouted Don Macedonio, his hoarse voice cutting through the warm air. 50 pesos, for a young, strong girl who knows how to sew and cook. The words fell upon Soledad like stones thrown into a calm lake, creating waves of humiliation that spread throughout her entire being. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching the ants that carried crumbs larger than themselves, finding in this sight a metaphor for her own existence. The murmur of the small crowd grew like the buzzing of irritated bees. Sunburned faces, approached calloused hands touched her arm as if she were an animal at the market. Soledad closed her eyes and tried to transport herself elsewhere, anywhere that wasn't there. It was then that a soft but firm voice cut through the chatter. "I'll pay the 50 pesos. Soledad slowly raised her gaze and saw a tall man with a worn leather hat and dark eyes that seemed to carry deep stories. There was no cruelty in that sun-marked face, only a serene determination that made her frown with curiosity. Francisco Herrera took the coins from his pocket without haste, counting them one by one in his calloused palm. The metal shone under the afternoon sun, and each coin that fell into Don Macedonio's hand sounded like one door closing and another opening. "It's done," said Francisco, his voice deep, like the rumble of distant thunder. He turned to Soledad, and, for the first time that terrible day, someone looked directly into her eyes. "Come, señorita, let's go home." Soledad hesitated, her feet seeming to have grown roots in the square's ground. Home. The word echoed strangely in her ears. She hadn't had a home for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to belong somewhere. But there was something in Francisco's posture, in the way he waited patiently for her decision, that made her take the first step. And then another, and another, until she was walking beside him toward a simple cart that waited in the shade of a solitary tree. What Soledad didn't know was that Francisco had felt the moment he saw her in the square, the same tightness in his chest that he felt when observing a wounded bird. It wasn't pity, but recognition. A soul identifying another soul that needed a safe place to heal. As the cart moved away from the square, raising a cloud of golden dust, Soledad looked back one last time. Villa del Silencio already seemed smaller, more distant, like a nightmare that begins to dissolve with the arrival of morning. But would it really be an awakening that awaited her, or just another kind of dream, perhaps sweeter, but still uncertain? The road to El Refugio. The road that led to El Refugio Ranch wound between hills covered with dried grass and cacti that raised their thorny arms like silent prayers to the sky. Soledad observed the landscape in silence, feeling the rhythmic swaying of the cart like a lullaby that gradually calmed the tremors of her body. Francisco didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. From time to time, he discreetly pointed to a hawk that glided in circles or to a stubborn little flower that sprouted between the stones. Simple gestures that said more than any speech about his character. When El Refugio finally appeared on the horizon, Soledad felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't a grand house, but there was something in the arrangement of the buildings, in the white-painted wooden fence in the garden, that fought against the drought, that spoke of care and love. "This is it," said Francisco softly, as if presenting a secret treasure. The main house had adobe walls and a covered porch, where rocking chairs waited for conversations that perhaps had never happened. Windows framed in sky blue opened to the world like hopeful eyes, and no smoke came from the chimney, suggesting a loneliness that echoed her own. Francisco helped her down from the cart, and Soledad noticed how his hands were large but gentle, how he avoided touching her more than necessary. There was respect in that gesture, a consideration she hadn't known for a long time. "Are you hungry?" he asked, and the question sounded so natural that Soledad almost forgot she was a stranger in that place. She nodded timidly, and Francisco led her into the house. The interior was simple but welcoming, with dark wooden furniture polished by time, and colorful blankets that brought warmth to the rooms. On the walls, framed photographs showed a younger Francisco beside a woman with a sweet smile and a boy with bright eyes. Soledad stopped before one of the photographs, feeling a strange pang in her chest. There was so much happiness in those faces, frozen in time, that she could almost hear their laughter echoing through the silent corridors. "They traveled to the capital," said Francisco, noticing her interest. His voice carried a discreet melancholy, like someone speaking of a dream that had been indefinitely postponed. "My wife wanted to see the grand theaters, and our son, he always dreamed of seeing the sea." Soledad nodded, understanding without words that there were no more questions to ask about the subject. Each house had its mysteries, just as each heart had its corners that preferred to remain in shadow. While Francisco prepared a simple meal of warm tortillas and beans, seasoned with herbs from the garden, Soledad discreetly explored the house. Each room told a story, the sewing abandoned on an armchair, the books marked at pages someone had read, halfway through the dried flowers in a vase that someone had forgotten to replace. It was a house suspended in time, waiting for the return of life that might never come. When they sat down to eat, Francisco served her first a gesture of courtesy that made her blush. They ate in a silence that gradually stopped being uncomfortable to become companionable. "Tomorrow, if you'd like, you can help in the garden," said Francisco finally. "The plants are waiting for hands that understand care." Soledad looked through the window at the half-abandoned garden, where roses fought against neglect and vegetables grew wild among the weeds. There was something desperately beautiful in that silent struggle for life. "I would like that," she said. And these were her first words since arriving at the ranch. Francisco smiled a small smile, but genuine like the first star of night. But when Soledad retired to the room that Francisco had prepared for her, a persistent question echoed in her mind. Why would a man buy a woman only to treat her with such kindness? And how long would this apparent goodness last? In the silence of the night, only the wind that whispered among the trees seemed to know the answer. The first days at the ranch passed like leaves carried by the wind, gentle, silent, but loaded with change. Soledad discovered that her hands had their own memory when they touched the moist earth of the garden, as if they knew of an earlier time when planting was an act of faith in the future. Francisco watched her from afar while she worked among the rose bushes, her deliberate and careful movements revealing a soul that understood the secret language of growing things. There was no hurry in her gestures, only a silent dedication that he recognized in himself. 3 weeks had passed when the past came knocking at the door like an unexpected windstorm. Soledad was watering the tomatoes when she heard the sound of approaching hooves. She raised her gaze and felt her blood freeze in her veins. Casimiro Villanueva dismounted his horse with the arrogance of someone who considers the world his particular property, his black mustache contrasting with the smile that didn't reach his small, cruel eyes. "Bien, bien," he said, removing his hat and running his hand through his oily hair. "There's my little Soledad. Francisco emerged from the house like a protective shadow, naturally positioning himself between Soledad and the unwelcome visitor. He said nothing, but his presence spoke for itself. "Herrera, isn't it?" Casimiro spat on the ground with contempt. "You've meddled in affairs that don't concern you. This woman belongs to me by right." "Señor Villanueva." Francisco's voice was calm like deep water, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Señorita Soledad is under my protection." Casimiro laughed a harsh sound like broken glass. "Protection? You paid 50 miserable pesos for her, but I have documents signed by her own father promising her in marriage 5 years ago. Documents that are worth more than your dirty coins." Soledad felt the world spin around her. She vaguely remembered her father forcing her to press, her thumb in ink on a paper when she was only 15, saying it was just a commercial agreement that she didn't need to understand. "Documents can be contested," said Francisco, but Soledad noticed the concern in his voice. "They can," agreed Casimiro, mounting his horse again. "But meanwhile, the law is on my side. I'll return in a week with the mayor and some men. I hope you'll—" "Be sensible, Herrera." When the sound of hooves faded in the distance, Soledad let the watering can fall from her trembling hands. The water spread across the dry earth, darkening it like tears. "I need to leave," she whispered, unable to look at Francisco. "I can't bring trouble to you." Francisco approached slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Soledad, look at me." She raised her eyes, and he saw in them the same terror he had witnessed in the square weeks ago. "This place is called El Refugio for a reason," he said softly. "It's a place where those who need protection can find it. You are not alone." But that night, while Francisco slept, Soledad packed her few possessions in a small bundle. She couldn't allow his kindness to be rewarded with violence. She knew men like Casimiro. They didn't accept defeat and didn't hesitate to hurt innocents, to get what they wanted. The storm forming on the horizon seemed to echo the tempest in her heart when she quietly opened the door and lost herself in the darkness of night. The wind howled among the trees like a lament, and the first drops of rain began to fall on her uncovered head. But Soledad continued walking each step, taking her away from the only house where she had known peace, toward an uncertain future that seemed as dark as the night that swallowed her. Behind her, El Refugio slept under the storm, not knowing that it had lost the only thing that had been bringing life back to its silent corridors. Past the storm, the rain fell like tears from heaven, transforming the earth into mud and the paths into small, furious rivers. Soledad had been walking for hours, her hair stuck to her face and her dress heavy with water, but she didn't dare seek shelter. Each lightning bolt that cut through the sky briefly illuminated her path, revealing a world washed by the tears of the storm. Her feet were cut by the stones of the path, and the cold penetrated to her bones, but it was nothing compared to the ice that had settled in her heart. She had left behind the only person who had offered her kindness without demanding anything in return, and this truth hurt more than any physical wound. When she stumbled for the third time, falling to her knees in the mud, Soledad finally allowed her tears to mix with the rain. She was lost, not just physically, but in every sense that mattered. There was no place in the world for someone like her, a woman without family, without money, without protection. It was then that she heard the sound of hooves approaching through the storm. Her first impulse was to hide, fearing it might be Casimiro, but when the mounted figure emerged from the darkness, she recognized Francisco's familiar silhouette, wrapped in a cloak that partially protected him from the rain. He dismounted and approached slowly, as if she were a frightened animal that might flee again. His eyes, even in the storm's gloom, carried such genuine concern that she felt her resolve crumble. "Soledad," he said softly, extending his hand. "Come home with me." "I can't," she replied, her voice almost lost in the wind's roar. "Casimiro will hurt you because of me. I'm not worth it." Francisco knelt in the mud beside her, not caring about his clothes or dignity. "You don't understand," he said, his voice loaded with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "It's not about what you're worth. It's about who you are." He removed his cloak and placed it over her trembling shoulders. "When you arrived at the ranch, something that had been dead for a long time began to breathe again. The garden bloomed, the house regained the smell of home cooking, and I remembered what it's like to wake up in the morning with expectation instead of just obligation. Soledad looked at him through the rain, seeing for the first time, not just the gentle man who had saved her, but the loneliness he carried like a second skin. They were two shipwrecks who had found each other in the same ocean of losses. "But the documents," she began. "Documents can be challenged," he repeated, but this time with more conviction. "And if we can't beat them legally, we'll find another way. But not alone, Soledad. Never alone again." She took his extended hand, feeling the strength and warmth that flowed through the touch. When he helped her stand, she understood that she wasn't just accepting his help to return to the ranch. She was accepting something much bigger and more frightening, the possibility that someone really cared about her. The ride back was slow and careful, with Francisco keeping the horse at a gentle trot so as not to frighten her. Soledad held on to him, feeling for the first time in her life what it was like to be truly protected, not as property, but as someone valued. When they arrived at the ranch, Francisco took her directly to the lit fireplace, wrapping her in warm blankets and preparing herbal tea that exhaled a comforting aroma. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as if she were made of fine crystal that could break with a sudden gesture. "Francisco," she said when he sat in a nearby chair, respecting her need for space, "why did you look for me in the storm?" He looked at the fire dancing in the fireplace before answering. "Because this house has already known too much loss. I couldn't bear to lose you too." That night, while Soledad dried her hair near the fire and Francisco discreetly checked that the doors were well locked, both understood that something had changed between them. It wasn't love yet, that would take time to grow, but it was something deeper than gratitude, stronger than convenience. It was the silent promise that they would face together any storm that came, both those that fell from the sky and those that arose from the human heart. But outside, among the night shadows, cruel eyes watched the illuminated house, and Casimiro Villanueva smiled his joyless smile, knowing that his time was coming. A new dawn. The morning sun brought with it a clarity that seemed to wash the world, but also the certainty that the previous night's storm had been only the prelude to another much more dangerous one that was approaching. Francisco found Soledad in the garden, her hands working among the flowers as if she could plant courage along with the seeds. She had spent the night without sleeping, her swollen eyes betraying the internal battle she had fought with herself. "Efrain brought news from town," said Francisco, approaching with the care of someone carrying delicate news. "The young son of I." The cart driver had just left, leaving behind the echo of hurried hooves and words that weighed like stones. Soledad raised her gaze, and Francisco saw in them the same silent determination he had noticed on the first day when she decided to accompany him, even not knowing where she was going. "Casimiro is in the square," he continued. "He brought a clerk from the capital and is showing the documents to anyone who wants to see. He's saying you fled from your matrimonial duties and that I'm a thief who stole someone else's property." The words fell between them like poisonous seeds, but Soledad didn't tremble. Instead, she wiped her hands on her skirt and straightened her shoulders with a dignity that came from somewhere deep within her soul. "Then it's time to go to town," she said, her voice calm like still water before the current. "I can't spend my life running." Francisco felt a wave of pride and terror simultaneously. Pride for her courage, terror for what could happen when two irreconcilable forces met in the public square. The trip to Villa del Silencio was made in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Soledad observed the familiar landscape, knowing that perhaps it was the last time she would see it as a free woman. Francisco gripped the reins with excessive force, his knuckles white like exposed bones. When they arrived at the square, they found a crowd larger than expected. Casimiro had turned the matter into a public spectacle, positioning himself beside a table where the documents were displayed like war trophies. "Look!" he shouted when he spotted Soledad. "The runaway bride returns, and she brought with her the thief who corrupted her." The crowd's murmurs grew like the buzzing of irritated wasps. Soledad felt the weight of all those gazes, some faces showing curiosity, others disapproval, and some few, something that could be sympathy. Don Alquicira, the grocery store owner, emerged from the crowd with a roll of papers in his hands. He was a small but respected man known for his honesty in business and his precise memory for legal details. "Señor Villanueva," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I've examined your documents. They're genuine, but there's an important legal issue." Casimiro frowned. "What issue?" "The agreement was signed by Soledad when she was a minor without the presence of independent witnesses or legal representation. Furthermore," Don Alquicira unrolled another paper. "There's here a territorial law from 1878 that establishes that forced marriage contracts can be annulled if the interested party contests them publicly." The crowd murmured, some people leaning forward to hear better. Soledad felt her heart beat faster, but not from fear, from hope. "This is ridiculous," exploded Casimiro. "The father has rights over his daughter." "He had," corrected Don Alquicira. "But she is now an adult woman, and according to law has the right to speak for herself." All gazes turned to Soledad. The silence that fell over the square was so dense it seemed solid. Francisco took a step to position himself beside her, not in front, a subtle gesture that said, this was her battle to fight. Soledad breathed deeply, feeling the air enter her lungs like liquid courage. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying the weight of 20 years of forced silences. "I never consented to marry Casimiro Villanueva," she said, each word sounding like a hammer against hot iron. "I was forced to sign documents I didn't understand when I was just a child. Now, as an adult woman, I publicly declare that I reject any agreement made without my consent." The crowd exploded in murmurs, some approving, others scandalized by a woman so openly challenging male authority. But Soledad hadn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, raising her chin with a dignity that made Francisco feel as if he were seeing a queen, "I freely choose to remain under the protection of Francisco Herrera, a man who treats me with respect and kindness." Casimiro advanced toward her, his face red with rage, but found Francisco in his path. There was no threat in Francisco's posture, only a solid presence like a mountain that said without words that to reach Soledad, Casimiro would have to go through him first. "This isn't over," hissed Casimiro, but there was something in his voice that suggested he might know he was losing ground. Don Alquicira rolled up the papers and addressed the crowd. "According to territorial law, Señorita Soledad's public declaration is valid. Señor Villanueva's documents are rendered ineffective." But while the crowd dispersed and Francisco and Soledad prepared to return to the ranch, neither noticed the look of pure hatred that Casimiro directed at them, nor the promise of revenge that shone in his small, cruel eyes. The law might be on their side, but Casimiro Villanueva was a man who had never accepted that laws applied to him. The letter from home. The letter arrived 3 days after the confrontation in the square, brought by Ephraim on a morning that smelled of jasmine and promises of rain. The paper was yellowed and folded as if it had traveled a long time to reach Soledad's hands. She immediately recognized her mother's trembling handwriting, Doña Refugio, and felt her heart tighten in a way she didn't expect. It had been more than a year since she'd had news of the woman who had given her life, but who had never found the strength to protect her from her husband's cruelties. Francisco noticed how her hands trembled as she held the letter, and discreetly found urgent tasks in the stable, giving her the necessary privacy to face ghosts that only she could fight. Soledad sat under the shade of the pear tree in the garden, and with careful fingers opened the envelope that brought news from Zacatecas. "My dear daughter, I hope this letter finds you well, and that God has placed kind people in your path. I learned from acquaintances that you freed yourself from the destiny your father imposed on you, and my heart rejoices even amid my sadness. I write to tell you that I am ill, Hija. The doctors say it's my heart, but I know it's the guilt that consumes me for having allowed him to do to you what he did. I know I have no right to ask, but I would like to see you one last time if possible. Not to ask for forgiveness, that would be asking too much, but so you know that I always loved you even when I didn't have the courage to show it. Your father died last month. He drank so much aguardiente that his liver couldn't take it. He died as he lived angry at the world and without peace in his soul. You are free of him forever. If you decide to come, I'll be at Comadre Esperanza's house on Flower Street. If you don't come, I'll understand. Some wounds are too deep to be healed by letters. With love from a mother who failed, but never, stopped loving Refugio Morales. The tears fell on the paper before Soledad realized she was crying. They weren't tears just of sadness, but of something more complex, a mixture of pain, relief, and a strange sense of liberation. Her father was dead. The man who had sold her like cattle, who had beaten her and her mother countless times, who had turned her childhood into a battlefield of fear and submission. This man no longer existed. Should she feel more than this strange emptiness, where she expected to find emotion? Francisco appeared silently at her side, as if he knew she needed his presence without having to ask. He didn't ask about the letter, just sat in the grass beside her, his presence solid like an anchor amid the storm of feelings. "My mother is ill," Soledad finally said, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. "She wants to see me." Francisco nodded, waiting. He had learned that Soledad processed her thoughts at her own pace, and that pressing would only make her close up, like a flower in the first frost. "My father died," she added, and there was surprise in her own voice that she could say the words without feeling more pain. "How do you feel about that?" Francisco asked softly. Soledad considered the question for a long moment, watching a butterfly dancing among the garden flowers. "Free," she said finally. "And guilty for feeling free." Francisco extended his hand, slowly allowing her to decide if she wanted the comfort of touch. When she intertwined her fingers with his, he felt the tension flow from her body like water finding its level. "Do you want to go see her?" he asked. "Yes," said Soledad, surprised by the certainty in her own voice, "but I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are the strongest person I know," said Francisco, and there was such conviction in his voice that Soledad almost believed him. "And this time you won't go alone." The trip to Zacatecas was planned for the following week. Francisco arranged with Gregorio, the elderly day laborer, who sometimes helped at the ranch, to take care of the animals and property. There were no questions about accompanying Soledad. It was simply accepted that wherever she went, he would go, too, like a protective shadow that chose to follow the light. On the night before departure, they sat on the porch watching the stars that dotted the sky like pearls scattered on black velvet. Soledad wondered if her mother was looking at the same stars, if she too was afraid of the meeting that could heal old wounds or open even deeper ones. "Francisco," she said softly, "thank you for not letting me face this alone." He turned to look at her, and in the soft moonlight she saw something in his eyes that made her feel as if she was seeing her own reflection, the gratitude of someone who had found in the other's company a reason to believe that perhaps they weren't destined for loneliness forever. "Thank you for letting me accompany you," he replied, and both understood that this simple exchange was in fact the confession of something much deeper than words could express. The night wind brought the perfume of garden flowers, and for a moment, both allowed themselves to imagine that the future could be as sweet as that aroma that enveloped them like a silent promise. The journey and reconciliation. The trip to Zacatecas had been like diving into ancient waters, where each mile traveled took Soledad deeper into memories she had buried like cursed treasure. The meeting with her mother had been painful and healing at the same time, two women recognizing each other through the scars they carried, finding in shared tears a strange form of redemption. Doña Refugio was more fragile than Soledad expected, her hands trembling like dry leaves, but her eyes carried the same soft light she remembered from childhood. They spoke little because some things are too big for words, but they embraced much as if they could heal decades of separation through touch. When they departed back to El Refugio 3 days later, Soledad carried with her something she didn't expect to find: peace. Not complete forgiveness that would take more time, but the understanding that her mother had also been a victim of circumstances and that love, even when imperfect, still had value. Francisco had remained discreetly in the background during the meetings, offering his presence without intruding, allowing Soledad and her mother to rebuild bridges that time had corroded. It was when he observed the two women together that he completely understood where Soledad drew her silent strength from. It was a gift passed from mother to daughter, like a precious inheritance. They were only a few miles from home when they saw the column of dark smoke cutting through the blue sky like a scar. Francisco's heart raced, and he whipped the horses, making the cart jump dangerously over the path stones. Soledad held on tightly, but said nothing. She too knew what that smoke meant. When they arrived at the ranch, they found the main stable. Thin flames, the fire licking the sky like tongues of a hungry demon. Gregorio ran from side to side with water buckets, desperately trying to control the fire, but it was clearly a losing battle. "The horses!" shouted Francisco, jumping from the cart, before it even stopped completely. Together they managed to get the 3 frightened horses out of the stable before the roof collapsed in a rain of embers and charred wood. The animals whinnied in terror, their wide eyes reflecting the flames that consumed their home. It was only when the fire began to diminish, leaving behind just a skeletal structure of charred beams, that Francisco found the piece of paper nailed to the main house door. The words were written in thick charcoal, the handwriting deliberately disguised. "This is just a sample. Next time it will be the house, and maybe you'll be inside." Soledad read over his shoulder, feeling a cold anger ignite in her chest. Casimiro had crossed the line from legal intimidation to pure violence, and she knew this was her fault. If she hadn't publicly challenged his authority, if she had simply fled far away. "No," said Francisco, as if he could read her thoughts. "Don't blame yourself for the acts of a coward who burns property in the dark." Gregorio approached, his face covered with soot and sweat. "I saw 3 men galloping south when I arrived," he said, spitting ashes. "One of them was Villanueva, I'm sure." Francisco observed the smoking remains of the stable, calculating the damage. It wasn't just the structure. They had lost tons of haywork equipment, and one of the horses was injured. The loss was considerable, but not devastating. What worried him more was the escalation. Casimiro had moved from legal threats to property destruction. The next step would be personal violence, and Francisco knew he couldn't protect Soledad from a man willing to use fire as a weapon. That night, while they mounted guard in shifts, Francisco made a decision that had been germinating in his mind since the confrontation in the square. In the morning, he would ride to Villa del Silencio to talk to some people, not the local authorities who were probably in Casimiro's pocket, but other farmers and merchants who were also tired of the man's intimidation. It was time to find out if there were others in the region willing to take a stand. Soledad, for her part, watched the stars through her room window, a new determination growing in her chest, like an ember transforming into flame. She had spent her entire life running from men like Casimiro, allowing their cruelty to dictate her choices. But now she had something to fight for, not just her own freedom, but a place where she had found peace and a person who valued her not for what she could give, but for what she was. If Casimiro wanted war, then he would have war. But this time, he would discover that he had completely underestimated the strength that can sprout when a woman decides to stop running and start fighting. Foi subarondat the alliance. The sun hid behind distant mountains when Francisco returned from Villa del Silencio, bringing news that made Soledad's heart race with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had spent the day talking discreetly with other farmers and merchants and discovered that they weren't the only ones suffering from Casimiro's intimidations. Don Alquicira lost a cart full of merchandise last month, Francisco told, while caring for his sweaty horse. Burned on the road exactly like our stable, and Miguel Santos had his well poisoned after he refused to sell his lands for a ridiculous price. Soledad absorbed this information while preparing a simple dinner. Her hands moved automatically among the ingredients, but her mind worked furiously, connecting dots that formed a clear pattern of systematic violence. "Will they help us?" she asked. "They're organizing a meeting for tomorrow night," replied Francisco, washing the soot from his arms in the basin. "At Don Alquicira's house, they say it's time someone did something about Casimiro." That night, after checking twice that all doors and windows were locked, Francisco and Soledad sat on the porch watching the stars that shone like promises of hope in the dark sky. "Francisco," said Soledad softly, her voice mixing with the whisper of wind among the trees, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, noticing how the moonlight made her pale skin almost translucent like fine porcelain. When you bought me in that square, I thought I was just trading one type of prison for another. She continued her words, chosen with the care of someone handling fragile crystal. But you gave me something I never had choice. Francisco felt his throat tighten. Soledad, let me finish, she said gently, placing her hand over his. I choose to stay. Not because I have nowhere to go, not because I need protection, but because when I'm with you, I remember who I was before they taught me to be afraid. The words floated between them, like petals carried by the wind, delicate but loaded with meaning. Francisco turned his hand so their palms touched, feeling the warmth that flowed between them like warm water. I also have something to tell you, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. When you arrived here, this house was just a place where I existed, counting the days. You transformed it into a home. Soledad felt warm tears sprout in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, the soul identifying its two halves that fit perfectly, despite all the cracks and scars. Soledad, said Francisco, standing and extending his hand to her, will you be my wife, not by obligation or convenience, but by choice? She took his hand and stood feeling as if she were emerging from deep waters to breathe pure air for the first time. Yes, she said, and the words sounded like music in her own ears. There was no priest in Villa del Silencio that night, nor official witnesses or legal documents. But under the starry mantle of the Mexican sky, Francisco and Soledad made their promises with a sincerity that made any formal ceremony pale in comparison. Francisco took a simple copper ring from his pocket. It had belonged to his grandmother, he said, and carried the blessing of a love that lasted 50 years. Soledad had no ring to offer in return, so she took a blue ribbon from her hair and tied it around Francisco's ring finger, creating an unlikely but deeply meaningful symbol of union. I promise to walk by your side, said Francisco, sliding the ring onto Soledad's finger, not as your protector or owner, but as your companion in all seasons of life. I promise to share your burdens, replied Soledad, adjusting the blue ribbon on his finger, and multiply your joys, building with you a future that honors both our past and our dreams. They kissed then slowly, as if sealing not just their promises but years of loneliness and pain that finally found their end. The kiss tasted of happy tears and fulfilled promises of gardens that would bloom and children who might one day run among the rose bushes. When they separated, the world seemed different, brighter, fuller of possibilities. The same problems still existed. Casimiro was still a threat, and challenges waited on the horizon. But now they would face everything together, united not just by fate but by a conscious and celebrated choice. That was the first night they slept in the same bed, not by necessity or convenience, but as husband and wife who had chosen to share, not just their bodies but their souls. Soledad fell asleep listening to Francisco's steady heartbeat, a sound that would become the soundtrack of her new life. And while they slept intertwined under blankets that smelled of lavender, and hoped they never imagined that the greatest test of their union was still to come, and that they would need all this newfound strength to face the storm that Casimiro, Villanueva, was preparing in the night shadows. But for this night they were just two hearts that had found their home in each other, two souls that proved that true love can grow even in the most arid soil, when it's watered with patience, respect, and the courage to believe that everyone deserves to be loved for who they are, and not for what they can offer. The confrontation. The meeting at Don Alquicira's house seemed more like a conspiracy of revolutionaries than a gathering of respectable merchants. 12 men squeezed into the small living room, their low voices carrying the weight of years, of repressed frustrations. Miguel Santos, a farmer whose hands were as big as shovels, pounded his fist on the table. "Villanueva has crossed the line," he said, his voice rough with contained anger. First, it was just intimidation requests for protection. Now he's destroying properties and threatening families. We know he has some of the lawmen in his pocket, added Don Alquicira, serving homemade aguardiente to the gathered men. But we are more numerous, and our cause is just. Francisco listened while each man told his story: burned carts, poisoned wells, threatened daughters, sabotaged businesses. It was a pattern of terror that Casimiro had been building, methodically isolating his victims so they would feel helpless and alone. "The question is," said Ramon the blacksmith, "what do we do now? We can't just wait for him to decide to burn us one by one." "We could go to the capital authorities," suggested another. "That would take months," replied Miguel. "And meanwhile, how many of us will lose everything?" It was then that Francisco stood up, feeling the weight of all gazes upon him. "There's one thing Casimiro didn't expect," he said slowly, "that we would unite." He then told about the silent ultimatum he had received about how Casimiro had escalated to violence because legal intimidations had failed. "He's desperate," Francisco concluded. "Desperate men make mistakes." Don Alquicira nodded thoughtfully. "Do you have a proposal?" "Yes," said Francisco, and there was something in his voice that made everyone lean forward. "Let's give him exactly what he wants, a confrontation, but on our terms, not his." The plan Francisco outlined was simple, but risky. They would spread the news that there would be a big commercial transaction at El Refugio Ranch at the end of the week, a fictional cattle sale that would attract Casimiro like a bee to honey. When he came with his men to sabotage it, he would find not a defenseless family, but a dozen armed and determined men. "It's dangerous," said Miguel. "If something goes wrong." "If we do nothing," interrupted Francisco, "he'll destroy us one by one until no one is left to resist." The vote was unanimous. In the 3 days that followed, El Refugio Ranch transformed into an anthill of activity. The men took turns on guard shifts, checking weapons and planning positions. Soledad cooked for the makeshift army, her hands working automatically, while her mind processed the magnitude of what was happening. For the first time in her life, she was at the center of something bigger than her own survival. These men were risking their families and properties for a matter of principle, and she knew it was partly because of her. "Are you afraid?" asked Francisco on the night before the planned confrontation, while checking his rifle for the 10th time. "Yes," admitted Soledad, "but not the kind of fear that paralyzes. It's the kind of fear that awakens." She looked through the window at the landscape that had become her home, observing the men strategically positioned around the property. "Francisco, if something happens to me—" "Nothing will happen," he said firmly. "You'll stay in the house away from danger." Soledad turned to him with that determined look he had learned to recognize and respect. "This is my fight as much as yours. I won't hide while good men risk their lives for my freedom." Before Francisco could protest, the sound of approaching hooves cut through the night like a sharp blade. It was earlier than they expected, but there was no doubt Casimiro had arrived. Francisco looked through the window and counted at least 8 men, all armed, galloping toward the ranch. With the confidence of those who expected no resistance, he whistled low the agreed signal and saw shadows moving in positions around the property. "Herrera," shouted Casimiro, his voice carrying through the night. "We know you're there. Send the woman out and maybe we'll let you live." Francisco breathed deeply and opened the main door, keeping his rifle by his side where it could be seen. "Villanueva," he said, his voice calm as still water. "You're on private property." Casimiro laughed, that harsh sound Soledad had learned to hate. "Property. This land will be mine before dawn, along with everything on it." It was then that the lanterns lit up around the property, illuminating the positions where the men of Villa del Silencio waited with their weapons pointed. Suddenly, Casimiro's men found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and outpositioned. "As I was saying," asked Miguel Santos, emerging from the shadows with his rifle pointed at Casimiro's chest. The expression on Casimiro's face was comical in its total surprise. He had come expecting to find a defenseless family and found himself facing a coordinated ambush. "This is illegal," he shouted, but his voice had lost all previous arrogance. "Like burning stables and poisoning wells," replied Don Alquicira, also revealing himself. The confrontation that followed was more anticlimactic than dramatic. Surrounded and outnumbered, Casimiro's men dropped their weapons without a fight. Casimiro himself, realizing that his era of terror had come to an end, tried a desperate escape, but was easily captured by Ramon, who brought him down from his horse with the efficiency of someone who shod wild horses every day. When the sun rose, over El Refugio Casimiro Villanueva and his men were tied up in the makeshift cellar, awaiting the arrival of authorities that Don Alquicira had sent Efrain to fetch from the capital during the night. Soledad watched from the porch when they took Casimiro away finally in chains after years of terrorizing innocent people. She should feel satisfaction, but instead felt only a strange sense of emptiness, as if a part of her life, even if terrible, had come to an end. "It's over," said Francisco, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Yes," she agreed, leaning against him. "Now the rest of our lives begins." And while the men dispersed back to their families and businesses, carrying with them the satisfaction of having taken a stand against injustice, Francisco and Soledad remained on the porch watching the sun paint the sky gold and rose. The garden needed care, the stable needed to be rebuilt, and there were 1,000 small tasks waiting for their hands. But for the first time since they met, there was time for everything. Time without fear, time without looking over their shoulders. Time to build the life they had chosen together. The fight was over. Real life was just beginning. 8 years later, March 1891, the sound of children's laughter floated through El Refugio's garden like music made of pure joy, mixing with birdsong and the whisper of wind among the fruit trees that now grew tall and generous. Soledad raised her gaze from her vegetables to watch Carmen, her 8-year-old daughter, running among the rose bushes, with her arms extended as if she were a bird. Her dark hair flew behind her like a freedom flag, and her eyes, so much like Francisco's, shone with the innocent confidence of a child who had never known fear. "Mama!" shouted Esperanza, the 5-year-old daughter, appearing from behind the house with a bouquet of wild daisies clutched in her little hands. "Look what I found for you." Soledad knelt to receive the gift, inhaling the sweet perfume of the flowers while kissing her daughter's sweaty forehead. Esperanza had inherited her gentle and observant nature, always finding beauty in details that others passed by. From the porch came the sound of Francisco reading aloud to Manuel, the 3-year-old, youngest, who preferred stories to more active games. The boy was nestled in his father's lap, his big curious eyes absorbing every word like a small eager sponge. "Once upon a time there was a knight who didn't wear armor." Francisco read his voice-changing tone for each character, "because he discovered that true protection comes from the love we carry in our hearts." Soledad smiled, recognizing one of the stories Francisco invented for the children tales, where dragons were tamed with gentleness, where princesses saved knights, and where courage was always linked to compassion. The ranch had prospered beyond their most optimistic expectations. The new stable was larger and more functional than the original, and they had expanded the lands with the purchase of neighboring properties. But the real success wasn't measured in hectares or head of cattle. It was in the river of life that ran through every room of the house, in the table always set for one more visitor, in the reputation Soledad had built as a wise woman whom others sought in times of need. Doña Soledad came young women from Villa del Silencio. "My husband drinks too much and becomes violent. What do I do?" "Señora," said worried mothers, "my daughter refuses to eat. How can I help her?" And Soledad listened, really listened, offering not just practical advice, but the validation that their concerns mattered. Their feelings had value. She had transformed her experience of pain into wisdom that could serve others, creating a silent network of women who supported each other. The afternoon was dying in golden tones when the family gathered at the table for dinner. The children chattered about their day's adventures. Carmen had discovered a hummingbird nest. Esperanza had learned to braid flowers into the gentle horses. Manis and Manuel insisted he had seen a talking rabbit, though no one else had witnessed this miracle. Francisco watched his family around the table and felt a gratitude so deep it sometimes made him dizzy. There were moments, especially when he woke early in the morning and saw Soledad sleeping peacefully beside him, when he had to pinch himself to confirm he wasn't dreaming. "Papa," said Carmen, always the most direct, "why does Mama sometimes get sad when she thinks we're not looking?" Francisco exchanged a quick glance with Soledad, who smiled reassuringly. They had decided long ago that they would be honest with the children, adapting the truth to their capacity for understanding. "Sometimes," said Soledad carefully, Adult people carry memories of difficult times, like invisible scars on the heart. It doesn't mean we're sad now, but that we remember how important it is to value happy moments. Esperanza frowned, processing this information with the seriousness she applied to all adult world mysteries. Like when I hurt my knee and then I'm happy when it doesn't hurt anymore. Exactly like that, mija, said Soledad, stroking her daughter's hair. After the children went to bed, Francisco and Soledad sat on the porch as they did every night, watching the stars that seemed brighter than they used to in the city. The routine had become sacred, a moment to reconnect as husband and wife after a day lived as parents and administrators of a prosperous property. "We received a letter from Zacatecas today," said Francisco softly. Soledad had maintained regular correspondence with her mother after the reconciliation, and each letter was received with the mixture of joy and apprehension that characterizes relationships still in the healing process. "How is she?" asked Soledad. "Better. She says she's helping at the local orphanage teaching sewing to the girls, and she asks when we're going to visit her again." Soledad considered this, watching the moon that bathed the garden in silver light. "Maybe in the summer," she said. "It would be good for the children to know their abuela, and for her to see how her granddaughter became a strong woman." Francisco took her hand, tracing with his thumb the copper ring she still wore now, polished by time until it shone like gold. Beside it, Soledad wore a silver wedding band that he had bought when Manuel was born, but the copper ring remained on her little finger, a tangible reminder of promises made under the stars on a night that changed their lives forever. "Sometimes I'm afraid to wake up and discover that all this was a dream," confessed Francisco. Soledad turned to look at him, seeing reflected in his eyes the same grateful disbelief that sometimes assaulted her. "If it's a dream," she said, "then it's one we're dreaming together, and that makes it real enough for me." That night, while they lay side by side listening to the children's soft breathing in the adjacent rooms, both knew they had achieved something rare and precious. Not just happiness, but conscious happiness, fully appreciated because they knew intimately its absence. The future stretched before them like an unplanted garden full of possibilities yet to be discovered. There would be challenges, certainly bad harvests, illnesses, the inevitable ups and downs of life. But they would face everything as they had faced Casimiro together, supported by the community they had helped form and strengthened, by the love they had chosen to build one day at a time. The stars continued their eternal dance over El Refugio, silent witnesses, to a family that had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, stories really can have happy endings, especially when they're written by people brave enough to believe they deserve love and wise enough to work for it every day. Spring 1892, new changes. The spring of 1892 brought with it more than flowers and promising harvests. It also brought changes that no one had anticipated, but which, like all true transformations, had been gestating silently for a long time before emerging into the light. Soledad was in the garden teaching Carmen to graft rose bushes when Don Alquicira's cart appeared on the dusty road. But it wasn't the elderly merchant who was driving, it was his daughter Elena, a 22-year-old young woman who had recently returned from the capital with modern ideas and a determination that reminded of Soledad herself in her days of greatest courage. "Doña Soledad," said Elena, descending from the cart with the grace of someone who grew up among horses and commerce. "I need to speak with you. It's about the women of the region." They sat under the shade of the pear tree, now robust and generous, while Carmen ran after a butterfly that had taken interest in the newly planted flowers. Elena then spoke about something she had been observing, how the women of Villa del Silencio and surroundings sought Soledad not just for personal advice, but for practical survival matters. "My Aunt Maria had to sell her chickens because she didn't know how to negotiate a fair price," Elena told. "The blacksmith's wife needs help managing the workshop finances because Ramon got injured and can't work. And there are at least 6 young widows in the region who have no idea how to keep their properties running." Soledad listened with growing interest, recognizing in each example a wasted opportunity. She herself had learned by necessity and observation how to negotiate with suppliers, how to manage the ranch's account books, how to plan crops and manage resources. "What are you proposing?" asked Soledad, though she already suspected where the conversation was heading. A school, said Elena, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Not a traditional school, but a place where women can learn practical skills, reading, basic mathematics, home administration, legal rights. Papa offered the big barn behind the grocery store as a location, and several families have already shown interest. The idea was simultaneously simple and revolutionary. In a region where female education rarely went beyond sewing and basic cooking, proposing that women learn about business and laws was almost radical. "And you want me to be the teacher?" asked Soledad. "We want you to be the director," corrected Elena. "I can teach about laws and legal procedures. I learned a lot in the capital. Doña Teresa, the midwife, can teach about health and basic medical care. Esperanza, the priest's wife, can help with reading and writing." Francisco, who had approached silently during the conversation, positioned himself behind Soledad's chair with a thoughtful expression. He knew his wife well enough to recognize the gleam in her eyes, the same that appeared when she found a project that captured her imagination. "It would be a big commitment," he said carefully, not as an obstacle but as someone who wanted to make sure she had considered all implications. "It would be," agreed Soledad. "But it would also be a chance to help other women find the strength I found not through dramatic circumstances, but through knowledge and preparation." Elena stayed late that night working with Francisco and Soledad to outline a practical plan. They would start small, perhaps a dozen women meeting twice a week. The curriculum would include basic literacy skills, practical mathematics for managing household budgets, legal knowledge about property and marriage rights, and agricultural techniques that could be applied to small gardens. "The most important thing," said Soledad, "is that they learn they have value beyond their ability to serve others, that their opinions matter, that their decisions have weight." In the months that followed, the women's school, as it was affectionately nicknamed by regional residents, grew beyond the most optimistic expectations. What began as a dozen students expanded to more than 30, including some who traveled miles every week to participate in classes. Soledad discovered that teaching was as rewarding as learning had been. There was something deeply satisfying in seeing a woman who had never held a pen manage to write her own name, or observing a shy widow develop enough confidence to negotiate a better price for her products at the market. Francisco and Soledad's children adapted to the changes with the natural flexibility of youth. Carmen, now 9 years old, frequently helped during classes distributing materials and assisting students who had difficulties. Esperanza, at 6, absorbed the lessons like a little sponge, while Manuel, at 4, played quietly in a corner of the classroom, apparently unaware he was witnessing something historically significant. Francisco supported the project in every possible way, from transporting materials to caring for the children, when Soledad needed to dedicate herself entirely to teaching. There were moments when he marveled at his wife's transformation. The shy and wounded woman he had met in the square had become a respected educator, a community leader whose opinion was sought on matters that went far beyond female education. But it was during the school's year-end celebration, when he saw Soledad standing before more than 50 people, men and women, students and family members, speaking with authority and compassion about the importance of education as a tool of liberation, that Francisco completely understood how true love works. He hadn't saved Soledad. Instead, he had offered a safe environment where she could save herself, discover her own strengths, and then use those strengths to help others. True love doesn't diminish one person to aggrandize another. It creates space for both to flourish completely. While Soledad spoke about plans to expand the school and perhaps create a loan program for women entrepreneurs, Francisco felt the same pride a gardener feels when seeing a seed he planted transform into a tree that produces enough fruit to feed an entire community. The young woman who had been sold as property had become a force of social transformation. And the best of all, she was still his wife, his companion, the mother of his children, the woman with whom he shared pillows and dreams every night. Some seeds, thought Francisco while applauding with the rest of the audience, take time to germinate. But when they finally sprout, they can change the entire world. Autumn 1893, the challenge. The autumn of 1893 arrived, accompanied by clouds that seemed to carry more than simple rain. There was a restlessness in the air that made horses fidget in the stables and dogs bark at invisible shadows. The letter arrived on a grey October morning, brought by a messenger who had ridden all night from the capital. The official paper bore the territorial government seal, and when Francisco opened it with slightly trembling fingers, he felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Soledad," he called, his voice strangely controlled. "You need to see this." She approached, wiping her hands on her apron, after finishing preparing lunch for the children who were playing in the garden under Carmen's supervision. When she read the first lines of the document, Soledad felt a familiar coldness spreading in her chest, the same she had felt when she saw Casimiro for the first time in years. The territorial government had decided to review all land grants in the region, especially those that changed hands through irregular transactions. The letter specifically cited Soledad's questionable purchase and suggested that all properties acquired since then could be considered illegal. "They want us to appear at a hearing in the capital next month," said Francisco, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to come from his bones. "To clarify the legal status of our family." Soledad sank into a chair, the paper trembling in her hands. After years of peace, the past had returned to haunt them in a way they hadn't even imagined possible. "This is someone's work," she said finally. "Someone who knows our history and decided to use it against us." Francisco nodded grimly. Although Casimiro was imprisoned, his family still had influence in the region. A cousin of his had recently become a territorial official, and it wasn't hard to imagine how old vengeances could be motivating official investigations. That night, after the children went to bed with extra stories to compensate for the tension they sensed in their parents, Francisco and Soledad sat at the kitchen table to face the reality of their situation. "If we lose the land," said Francisco, "slowly we lose everything. The house, the ranch, the school, other children," added Soledad, her voice almost a whisper. "If they question the legality of our marriage, if they decide our union was based on an illegal transaction." She didn't need to complete the sentence. Both knew that in complex legal disputes, children often became pawns, especially when the legitimacy of their parents' marriage was in question. Francisco extended his hand across the table, taking Soledad's between his. "We won't let this happen," he said with a determination she recognized from the most difficult days of their fight against Casimiro. "We're going to fight." In the days that followed, El Refugio transformed into a center of frantic activity. Don Alquicira arrived with all the documents he could find about the original transaction. Elena brought her legal knowledge from the capital and other friends from the region, offered testimonies about Francisco and Soledad's character. But it was Carmen, with her precocious 9-year-old insight, who asked the question no one had dared formulate: "Mama, Papa, if we have to leave, where will we go?" Soledad looked at her eldest daughter, seeing reflected in her eyes the same concern and confusion she herself had felt at 20, when the future became completely uncertain. But there was a crucial difference. Carmen wasn't alone, wasn't helpless, and wasn't without resources. "I don't know, Mija," said Soledad honestly, "but I know that wherever we go, we'll go together, and wherever our family is, that will be our home." Carmen nodded with the seriousness of someone much older, then surprisingly smiled. "Then it's not so scary, is it? Because we take the most important things with us." That night, while Francisco checked the documents they would take to the capital for the 10th time, Soledad found herself in the garden observing the rose bushes she had planted and cared for years. Some of those plants had grown from seedlings she herself had grafted, creating unique varieties that existed nowhere else. If they had to leave El Refugio, the plants would stay behind. But the knowledge she had acquired about gardening, about administration, about teaching, no one could take that from her. And the seeds of change she had planted in other women's lives would continue growing regardless of where she was. Francisco found her there, standing among the flowers that reflected moonlight like small mirrors of hope. "Are you thinking of giving up?" he asked softly. "I'm thinking of starting over," she corrected, "again if necessary." He positioned himself behind her, wrapping her in his arms and feeling how she fit perfectly against his chest, as if they had been made to complete each other. "You know," he said, When I met you in that square, I thought I was saving you. Now, I realize you were saving me too, and if we have to do everything again in another place with other people, we'll be saving each other once more." Soledad turned in his arms, looking at the face that had become dearer to her than her own reflection. "No matter what happens in the capital," she said, "we've already won. We have a family, we have love, we have the certainty that we can overcome anything together." The kiss they shared under the stars tasted of tears and determination, of renewed promises and courage borrowed from each other. When they separated, both knew they were ready to face any storm, not because they weren't afraid, but because they had learned that true love doesn't eliminate fear, it just makes it easier to be brave. The trip to the capital would be long and uncertain. The hearing could result in the loss of everything they had built, but one thing remained unshakable: the family they had created, the love they had chosen, and the strength they discovered when they stopped running and began fighting for what really mattered. And if they had to start from scratch, well, they had done it before, and it had resulted in something more beautiful than either of them had dared to dream. The capital and justice. The territorial capital was a different world from Villa del Silencio. Paved streets replaced dirt paths. Brick buildings rose where adobe huts used to be sufficient, and the air carried the smell of progress mixed with nascent industry smoke. Francisco, Soledad, and Elena walked down Justice Avenue toward the territorial courthouse, their best clothes contrasting with the anxiety they carried like an invisible weight. Soledad wore the navy blue dress she had sewn especially for important occasions, and Francisco's copper ring shone discreetly on her finger like a protection talisman. The children had stayed in Villa del Silencio under the care of Don Alquicira and his wife, a decision that broke Soledad's heart, but which she knew was necessary. The hearing could last days, and regardless of the outcome, she preferred her daughters and son not witness the public humiliation that could follow. The territorial courthouse was an imposing grey stone building with columns that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who dared question government authority. Climbing the steps, Soledad felt echoes of the same vulnerability she had experienced in Villa del Silencio's square years ago, the sensation of being judged by men who didn't know or understand her story. Territorial Judge Aguirre was a middle-aged man, with greying hair and small glasses that gave his face a permanently severe expression. He presided over the hearing from behind an elevated table that made everyone else in the room seem small and insignificant. "Case number 347, announced the clerk. "Investigation of the legitimacy of Francisco Herrera's territorial grant, questioned based on irregular transaction involving purchase of person." The words echoed through the room like stones thrown in still water, creating waves of discomfort that Soledad felt in every cell of her body. She had prepared for this moment, but hearing her own life reduced to legal terminology still hurt in ways she didn't expect. The territorial prosecutor was a young man with political ambitions written in every calculated gesture. He presented the case against Francisco and Soledad with the precision of someone who saw the world in terms of legal precedents and career opportunities. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "this case represents a fundamental question about the values we want to establish in our territory. Can we allow properties to be acquired through transactions involving the purchase of human beings? Can we validate marriages that originated in such questionable circumstances?" Francisco felt his hands clench into fists under the table, but forced himself to maintain composure. There was too much at stake to allow emotion to compromise his capacity for rational response. It was then that Elena stood up, her legal knowledge, acquired in the capital, finally finding its moment to shine. "For your honor," she said, her voice clear and confident, "I would like to call the court's attention to the precedent established in the Morrison versus Territory of Arizona case from 1889, where it was determined that transactions carried out for the purpose of protecting individuals from abuse situations cannot be classified as commercial, and therefore are not subject to the same regulations." The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "Continue, señorita." Furthermore, Elena unrolled a document she had carefully prepared. "I would like to present sworn statements from 17 residents of Villa del Silencio and surroundings testifying about the defendant's moral character, and the protective nature of the transaction in question. What followed was a masterful presentation of evidence that completely transformed the case narrative. One by one, Elena read statements from people who knew Francisco and Soledad not just as respectable neighbors, but as community pillars who had contributed to the region's welfare in measurable ways. Don Alquicira testified about how Francisco had helped organize resistance against Casimiro Villanueva, protecting not just his own family, but the entire region from a violent predator. The blacksmith's wife spoke about how Soledad had saved her daughter from a high fever with her herbal medicine knowledge. Several women described how Soledad's school had transformed their lives, giving them tools to support their families and participate in the local economy in ways that were previously impossible. But it was when Elena called Soledad to testify, in her own defense, that the true power of truth manifested in the room. Soledad stood slowly, feeling the weight of all gazes upon her. For a moment, she was again the 20-year-old being examined like merchandise in the square. But then she remembered who she had become: teacher, wife, mother, community leader, and straightened her shoulders with the dignity she had built one day at a time over years of personal growth. "Your Honor," she began, her voice gaining strength. "With each word, it's true that I was sold by my father as if I were property, but Francisco Herrera didn't buy me, he freed me. The difference may seem subtle in legal terms, but it's fundamental in human terms." She then told her story not as a victim seeking pity, but as a survivor sharing wisdom. She spoke about how Francisco's kindness had created a safe space where she could discover her own strengths, how their marriage had been a free choice made by two people who loved each other, and how they had built not just a family but a stronger community. "If Your Honor annuls our marriage and questions our property," she concluded, "you won't be punishing a questionable transaction. You'll be punishing love, redemption, and proof that people can grow beyond their circumstances when given the chance. Do so." The silence that followed Soledad's testimony was so dense it seemed physical. Judge Aguirre removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, his face impenetrable. Finally, he addressed the prosecutor. "Senor Morales, based on the evidence presented, it seems to me that your arguments are founded on an extremely literal interpretation of the law that ignores both the context and the result of the transaction in question." Turning to Francisco and Soledad, the judge continued, "This court recognizes that although the original transaction may have been irregular by modern standards, it was carried out with honorable intentions and resulted in clear benefits, not only for the individuals involved, but for the entire regional community." Soledad felt her legs almost give way when she understood what the judge was saying. "Therefore," declared Judge Aguirre, striking the gavel on the table with final authority, "this court considers valid the marriage of Francisco Herrera and Soledad. Morales recognizes the legitimacy of their territorial property and closes this investigation without penalties." The explosion of relief and joy that followed was so intense that Soledad had to hold onto the chair to keep from collapsing. Francisco enveloped her in his arms, and for the first time in months both allowed themselves to believe that the future was secure. But more than that, they had proven to themselves and to the world that true love can overcome any scrutiny, that families built on solid foundations can resist any storm, and that sometimes justice really does prevail when brave people are willing to fight for it. The journey home would be long, but now it carried the taste of victory instead of uncertainty. El Refugio awaited them along with 3 anxious children and a future that finally definitively belonged to them. December 1893. Snow and promises. Snow had arrived early in northern Mexico that year, covering El Refugio with a white mantle that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Soledad watched through the kitchen window while her 3 children built a snowman in the garden, their laughter echoing in the crisp morning air like crystal music. Carmen, now 10 years old, directed the operation with the natural authority of an older sister, instructing Esperanza and Manuel about the proper placement of branches that would serve as arms. The girl had inherited not just Soledad's appearance, but also her silent determination and ability to lead through example. "Mama!" shouted Esperanza from the window, her face pink from the cold. "Can you give us a carrot for the muñeco's nose?" Soledad smiled, taking the biggest carrot she could find, and going out to the garden where Francisco was helping Manuel make perfectly round snowballs. The 4-year-old boy took his tasks very seriously, frowning with concentration while molding each sphere as if it were a work of art. "It's perfect, mijo," said Francisco, ruffling his son's dark hair. "Your snowman is going to be the most beautiful in the entire territory." It was true. The figure they had created together had something special, not just because it was made with love, but because it represented something bigger. It was the product of a family that had learned to work together, to create beauty, even in simple circumstances, to find joy in the everyday moments that make up a life. That afternoon, while the children played inside the house and snow continued falling softly, Francisco and Soledad sat by the fireplace with cups of hot chocolate perfumed with cinnamon. The fire crackled hypnotically, and the silence between them was the kind that only exists between people who know each other so deeply that words often become unnecessary. "We received a letter from the school today," said Soledad, finally taking an envelope from her pocket. "Elena writes that we have 23 applicants for next semester, including 3 women from the capital who heard about the program." Francisco smiled, feeling the familiar pride that always came when he considered how Soledad's education project had grown beyond their most optimistic expectations. "And how do you feel about that?" "Scared," she admitted, "and excited. It's an enormous responsibility, knowing that so many women are placing their hopes for change in something I helped create." "You're not alone in this," reminded Francisco, taking her free hand. "You never have been." Soledad nodded, recognizing the truth in those words. One of the most important lessons she had learned over the years was that true strength doesn't come from total independence, but from the ability to accept support and offer it in return. She had learned to ask for help when she needed it, to delegate responsibilities when appropriate, and to trust other people without losing her own identity. "Sometimes I think about the woman I was when we met," she said, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "She seems like another person in another life." "She wasn't another person," said Francisco softly. "She was you waiting for the opportunity to become who you really were inside. I just offered a safe place for that to happen." Soledad turned to look at him, seeing reflected in his eyes the same love that had grown gradually between them over the years, maturing like fine wine until it became something rich and complex and completely irreplaceable. "And I offered you a reason to believe in the future again," she said. "We're a good team, Francisco Herrera." "The best," he agreed, kissing her forehead with the tenderness of a sacred ritual. That night, after the children went to bed with stories about princesses who saved dragons and knights who won with gentleness, Francisco and Soledad walked through the snow-covered ranch, their steps leaving footprints that intertwined like a silent dance. The full moon bathed the landscape in silver light, transforming each bare tree into a delicate sculpture, each fence into a line of poetry written against the starry sky. The air was so pure and cold that each breath seemed to cleanse not just the lungs but also the soul. "Do you remember," said Soledad, stopping beside the place where the original stable had burned years ago, "how this place was when I arrived here?" Francisco observed the new and improved structure that had replaced the old one, its solid walls and strong roof promising protection for generations to come. "It was a house waiting for a family," he said. "Now it's a home full of life." They continued walking until they reached the garden where the rose bushes slept under the snow like promises of future spring. Soledad knelt and carefully cleared the snow from a small wooden plaque that Francisco had carved and placed in the center of the garden the previous year. The words engraved in the wood said simply, "Here grow flowers, planted with love, watered with tears of joy, and harvested with infinite gratitude." "Francisco," said Soledad, her voice carrying the weight of an important decision, "I want to have another child." He turned to her, surprised, but not shocked. There had been something in the way she had been watching babies at church lately, how her eyes lingered on small clothes on the line when they visited neighbors with young children. "Are you sure?" he asked, not questioning the desire but wanting to make sure she had considered all implications. "The school is growing, you have so many responsibilities." "Maybe that's exactly why," she said, standing and turning to look at him. Because I finally understand that I can be many things at the same time, mother, teacher, wife, community leader. I don't need to choose just one identity. Francisco enveloped her in his arms, feeling how she fit perfectly against his chest, as if they had been made to complete each other. "Then let's make another baby," he said, and there was genuine joy in his voice. One more proof that love can create life even where before there was only sadness. The kiss they shared under the falling snow tasted of future promises and precious memories of gratitude for the past and hope for what was to come. When they separated, both knew they had made a decision that would change their lives once more, but this time by their own choice at the right time, with enough love to sustain whatever changes came. 6 months later, at the beginning of summer, 1894, Esperanza Luz Herrera was born a small and perfect girl who arrived in the world with strong lungs and her mother's determination. Soledad held her daughter in her arms for the first time and understood that she had found a new dimension of love, one that didn't diminish what she felt for her other children, but expanded her heart to accommodate even more joy. Francisco watched, his wife with the newborn, and saw reflected in her the same fierce tenderness he had noticed when she cared for wounded rose bushes in the garden, the ability to nurture life, even when her own life had been difficult to give gentleness, even having received cruelty. Carmen Esperanza, who now insisted on being called Esperanza Grande to distinguish herself from her sister and Manuel, adapted to the new arrival with the natural flexibility of children who grow up in homes full of love. Each found their own way to help with the baby, creating a network of protection and affection that enveloped Esperanza Luz from her first days. In the years that followed, the family continued growing, not just in number, but in depth and connection. Soledad School became a respected institution that attracted women from throughout the territory, and Francisco expanded the ranch to include an agricultural training program for young people from the region. Together they created something that went beyond a simple rural property. They built a legacy of education empowerment and living proof that true love can transform not just 2 lives, but an entire community. In 1900, when Soledad turned 27, she found herself one Sunday afternoon sitting on El Refugio's porch, watching her 4 daughters and 1 son playing in the garden she herself had planted. Carmen, now a 16-year-old young woman, was teaching Esperanza Grande to make elaborate braids. Manuel, at 11, was building dollhouses for Esperanza Luz with the meticulous patience he had inherited from his father. Francisco approached silently and sat beside her, following her gaze to the idyllic scene unfolding before them. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I'm thinking," said Soledad slowly, "that when I was young I used to believe that happiness was something that happened to other people in other places. Something you found if you were lucky enough." She paused, watching a butterfly that landed delicately on a red rose. "Now I know that happiness isn't something you find. It's something you build one day at a time with the choices you make and the people you choose to love." Francisco took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And are you happy?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the last 15 years of shared life. "I'm complete," she said, gently correcting. "Happiness comes and goes like the seasons, but completeness, that's permanent when you find your place in the world." They remained sitting in companionable silence, watching their children grow before, their eyes knowing that in a few years they would leave to build their own lives, plant their own gardens, create their own families. But they also knew they had given these children something that neither Francisco nor Soledad had had in their own childhoods, the absolute certainty that they were unconditionally loved, that they had inherent value as human beings, and that the world was full of possibilities for those brave enough to pursue them. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in tones of gold and rose that rivaled the garden flowers, Soledad stood and extended her hand to Francisco. "Come," she said, smiling with the same mixture of shyness and determination he had seen in her on the first day. "Let's help the children prepare dinner. We have a family to feed." Francisco took her hand and stood, knowing that in a few hours they would sit around the table they had built together, sharing food prepared with love, telling, Stories that would become memories, creating one more day in the extraordinary life they had chosen to live together. And while they walked back to the house where their voices would join those of their children in a symphony of family life, both knew they had proven something important to themselves and to the world, that true love doesn't need to be dramatic, to be transformative. That sometimes the best stories are those built in shared silences and gentle gestures, that it's possible to flourish even when planted in difficult soil as long as you find the right light and enough water, and that every happy ending is in fact just the beginning of an even more beautiful new story. In the mountains around El Refugio, the wind whispered among the pines ancient songs about love that conquers families that heal and gardens that bloom, forever when cared for by the right hands. And somewhere in a dusty square that now existed only in memory, a 20-year-old young woman who once feared her own future smiled through time, knowing that all the tears, all the pain, and all the uncertainty had been worth it, because they had led her home to El Refugio, to Soledad, to love,